Okay, welcome everyone to today's panel on modernizing public comment. We have a great lineup of panelists for you today, which I will introduce briefly. But let me just say a few words about the topic at the outset, and then go over particularly some of the ground rules for discussion for today. So the topic, as the name suggests, looks at.
Reeve, I'm so sorry to interrupt. It looks like the attendees are still getting into the room. Can we just give them 1 minute to all get in, and then we can keep going?
Sure.
Can you see that? Sometimes Zoom takes a little while to get everybody into the webinar.
Got it. So maybe wait 30 seconds or so?
Yeah, that sounds good. It looks like we're at about 42. Some folks are still being added. I can give you a sign. Just bear with me. I've had this happen before, and then folks come in and they say, wait, I missed what you said. So Perfect. Just bear with us a little bit longer. All right, it looks like we've leveled off.
Great. All right. Thanks, Bridget. So, right. So welcome to today's panel on modernizing public comment. I will just say a few words at the outset first to introduce our very distinguished group of panelists with whom you'll be speaking today, and then briefly go over sort of some of the ground rules for discussion, because we do want to absolutely have an opportunity for all of you in the audience to pose your questions to us. So the topic as the name implies, looks at technologies and the effects that they have on the notice and comment process in agency rulemaking, and on public participation in the rulemaking process more broadly. This is obviously a very salient issue. There's been a lot of media attention as of late, as well as a number of reports. You may have seen the New York Attorney General actually just released a report on fraudulent comments or malattributed comments, particularly in the FCC net neutrality rule, but a handful of other agency rules. And then, as you hopefully also know, the administrative conference has an ongoing project on this topic. And I'll note at the outset that each of us has an ACUS affiliation. Indeed, you have 3 out of the 5 of us are consultants on that ACUS project, and we all are involved in some capacity. So let me just emphasize at the outset that this is not a forum on the ACUS project. We will be getting into a handful of issues, normative issues, that are most decidedly not a part of that ACUS study. So we're all speaking on our own behalf and not on behalf of the administrative conference, or for that matter, our respective affiliations. However, we will at various points be referring to the ACUS project because it is, of course, relevant to the topic. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. So first we have Nina Mendelson, who is the Joseph L. Sachs Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. We then have Bridget Dooling, who is a research professor at George Washington University. Then we have Dan Cohen, who is the Assistant General Counsel for Regulation at the Department of Transportation. And then we have Steve Balla, who is an associate professor of political science, public policy and public administration, and international affairs, also at George Washington University. And then finally, I'm Reeve Bull. I am the research director at the Administrative Conference of the United States. So the final thing I'll mention is just sort of the plan for today's discussion. So we wanted to mix things up a little bit. And so rather than having each panelist speak, I'm basically going to pose a series of questions. And for each question, I'll ask one of our panelists if he or she can sort of take the lead in terms of providing an initial response. But all of the panelists will have an opportunity to weigh in on each of the questions, because I think each of us has expertise on each of these topics. So the goal is for this to be sort of an interactive discussion. And then also for the participants, I will be monitoring the Q&A feature. If you could please put your questions in Q&A, not in the chat feature. I won't be monitoring that as closely. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. You can do so whenever you want. I'll be monitoring it over the course of the discussion, and I will try to the extent possible to work in your questions as part of the discussion, because some of them may be relevant to questions that we were planning to touch on anyway. And I'll perhaps interject questions here and there. But I will also leave some time at the end where we'll maybe transition from our discussion topics to audience questions. So we ensure that we get an opportunity to respond to each of the questions that you pose to us. So let me go ahead then and move to our first question for discussion today. And so the first topic that we'd like to look at is mass comment campaigns. It's a term that's often used. It's used in the context of the ACUS project, as well as other studies that have looked at public participation, mass public participation. And my question on this particular issue is you sort of have a definitional problem here. You know, when you refer to a mass comment campaign, what does that exactly mean? What's the threshold for a mass comment campaign? How many more comments does the agency need to get? Or how is the commenting process organized in a way that makes it a mass comment campaign? How common, once we define the issue, how common are these sorts of campaigns? Is it something that comes up frequently, or is it relatively isolated in terms of the rules that are subject to these sorts of campaigns? And then finally, who typically participates? What type of groups or entities are putting together these sorts of mass comment campaigns? So Steve Balla, one of our panelists, has done extensive research on this himself. So I'll turn to him first. And then I'll also turn to Dan Cohen, who is our only panelist who actually works currently at a regulatory agency. So I'd be very interested to get his thoughts as well. And then we'll open it up. So let me start with you, Steve.
Sure. Thanks, Reeve. You know, what I would say at the outset, and that's a lot of questions you pose there, and I'll answer some subset of those. First, just on how common mass comment campaigns are. And what I would say is, you know, although they're not rare, they're not super common. And so if we take the EPA as a touch point here, and you know, it'll be interesting maybe to compare and contrast with DOT experiences. But, you know, the EPA, you would think is an agency that's primed for mass comment campaigns. It engages in some of the most visible, important, controversial rulemakings. It has active stakeholders representing, articulating all kinds of viewpoints. And despite all of that, you know, again, it's not that mass comment campaigns are rare at the EPA, but over a 4-year period, of all of the EPA rules that were reviewed by OIRA, so kind of the big EPA rules, there were a total of 22 that experienced mass comment campaigns in one capacity or another. And so that's a pretty small numerator out of a much larger denominator. So it's really interesting in that when they occur, at least in some of the largest mass comment campaigns, attract a lot of media and public attention. But by and large, most of the time, rulemaking proceeds without mass comment campaigns. What other element that you raised, Reeve, I'll answer and then turn it over to Dan, is that if we look among those mass comment campaigns that I'm referencing, you know, these EPA mass comment campaigns, you know, who are the organizations who do most of the mobilizing of these campaigns? And what we found is that about 75% of the mass comment campaigns were organized by sort of the set of groups that would be characterized as environmental advocacy groups, groups representing workers' interests, maybe general progressive or public interest groups. What about the other 25% or so? That would be typically industries affected by what mass comment, what agencies are doing in their rulemakings. And so we do tend to see all forms, all different types of stakeholders engaging in mass comment campaigning, but it's certainly more prevalent on one side of the issue, one side, if you will, of the kinds of fault lines we often see in environmental rulemaking. All right, so I'll leave it there and turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, I would say that's, thank you, Steve. That is, that's fairly common amongst the agencies, I think. So just definitionally, I think when we're talking about mass comment campaigns, I think you want to separate them out slightly. So I view mass comment campaigns as when some organization is just ginning up a lot of people to send in comments on a particular topic. Usually they tend to be form comments. That could be 100 comments. It could be 50, 75 comments. There are the ones that become sort of popular or get into the press where you have millions of comments. Those are exceedingly rare. 22 even sounds like a large number, even at a place like EPA. So I don't know I don't know the numbers that came out of those, how you define that in terms of the 22 being mass commenting campaigns. But the number of rulemakings where we may have some form of organized commenting, it happens. It's not uncommon. It doesn't happen a whole lot. But we could get comments that are organized by some group to send in, and it could be 75 or 100 or something like that comes in a particular rulemaking. We still would think of that as a mass comment, in that it's a whole group of people sending in effectively the same comment, usually in some kind of a form. It happens, but it doesn't happen really all that often, even at that level. So it's not a particularly pervasive problem.
If I could just follow up on it with a data point to Dan's comment. I mean, we think of the archetypal mass comment campaign as like 1 million plus, just like enormous outpouring. But even among the EPA mass comment campaigns that I'm referencing, only 2 were like 500,000 or more. And they're the ones you've heard of: Waters of the United States, Clean Power Plan. All of the other rules that attracted mass comment campaigns, the EPA doesn't have a benchmark for it has to exceed a certain number to be considered. So just a batch of comments sharing common language, that's a mass comment campaign. And so the vast majority of these mass comment campaigns are of the order of magnitude Dan's talking about: 100, 1,000 maybe. I mean, the kinds that aren't going to make the Washington Post.
Can I chime in briefly here? I think it's also useful to think about this level of engagement as really focusing on a high level of individuals participating. The data on rulemaking generally has suggested that participation is really dominated by, well-financed regulated entities or regulated entity groups. And by contrast, I think what we think of as the rulemakings evoking mass participation is where we have lots and lots of individuals participating. So I want to distinguish that from rulemakings where, if you will, the scenario Dan talks about is implicated, where you have an organization that is trying to get people to submit and get people to sign on, perhaps to identical language. So I just want to add one tiny little data point, which may or may not be representative, which is just as of today, there are 2 large volume rulemakings pending on regulations.gov, in which more than 30,000 comments have been submitted in each. One is a NOAA proceeding on the kinds of turtle excluders that small shrimp fishing boats might use, more than 30,000 comments already. The other is on Department of Education priorities for teaching American history and civics in our high schools, including issues around race. Again, both are over 30,000. I think we ought to consider this part of the phenomenon because, whether there are identical comments or not, and I have not dug into the docket sufficiently to see, there's clearly a high level of individual participation. And I think that's what we ought to be focusing on.
Although just one thought on that is, it does appear, and Steve was sort of alluding to this, and I wonder if this is borne out in the research, at least from the, kind of the day-to-day perspective. It does seem like those mass campaigns are in fact organized by some typically well-funded organization. They are going out and soliciting either current members or potential members to weigh in because they've kind of excited them about a particular issue. I don't know what the.
What's interesting is most of the time, the agency is able to identify the quote sponsoring organization. The organizations are, obviously they're not hiding the fact that they're, organizing and mobilizing their members and those who support their viewpoint. But the EPA, it's using deduplication software to identify these batches of similar, identical comments. And it's interesting, at times the agency's not, they'll post, to regulations.gov, this is a mass comment campaign submitted by an unknown sponsor. And so it's not always clear, if it's not on a group's letterhead or if it's not mentioned in the text of a comment, who the sponsoring organization is. But I mean, that's the expectation, that even in those cases, there's some sponsoring organization lurking there.
Fantastic.
When I get to our next question, I hope we'll talk about whether organizational involvement is a problem. I personally think it's fine, and organizations are doing a very useful service in letting people know what the government is doing and facilitating their participation. But I imagine we're going to get to this in more detail a little bit later.
Yeah, excellent comment, Nina. And that, I think, tees up perfectly our next question, which is basically, what are the pros and cons of mass comment campaigns? And I think Nina has well articulated what the pros, may be. That it lowers the barrier to entry. It may be a very effective mechanism for people who might not otherwise participate in the comment process to be able to have their voice heard by the agency. But the potential downside may be that, and I think it's both on the public end as well as on the agency end. On the agency end, it may be difficult to process large volumes of comments, whether or not, maybe particularly if they're distinct from each other, but even if they, have similar language. And then it may also drown out the docket to some extent. Does it make it hard to find unique comments if you have a large number of identical comments? So let me turn to Bridget on that question initially. I'd love to get her thoughts, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, thanks, Reeve. So I'll kick us off, and I know the rest of the panel will round this out. So there are a wide and passionately held range of views on this topic, particularly when you frame it like pros and cons. And these views are often portrayed as being deeply in tension with each other. But I'd actually like to suggest that there are at least some areas where the tension is the result of people talking past each other on this issue, and that this is an area that really benefits from additional discussion and engagement, the kind that I think we're getting into today. So on the one end, there's this idea that civic engagement should be welcomed and embraced in whatever form it manifests, and that any associated government challenges of wrangling big campaigns should really just not be an issue that we give much weight to. Exalting people to let your voice be heard is sort of part of how this shows up in the way we describe this issue, and that rulemaking is just one domain in which this type of civic voice should be encouraged and supported. And this is in part because some civic engagement tends to lead to other forms of civic engagement, and this type of activity is good for society above and beyond the merits of engagement on any particular rule. Right, so there's this like larger social good that we're trying to stimulate. On the absolute other end, the objection is that rulemaking is not a vote. You'll hear people say this, and there endeth the debate. There endeth the discussion. This perspective is going to tend to doubt the value of mass comment campaigns. It'll emphasize the management challenges of these campaigns and fail to find much meaning therein because they're seen as conveying, a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of vote that agencies can't use to build towards a reasoned decision. So my views on this issue have really evolved. I was the consultant on an ACUS report in 2011 that declared that notice and comment rulemaking was not a plebiscite and that this was settled. I do remain confident that this is true. I am confident that that issue is settled. The point of notice and comment rulemaking is not simply to tally the yays and the nays and then to just do what the majority wants. What has changed for me, though, is that I no longer think that's the end of the discussion. So the question is, what kind of information mass comment campaigns can possibly communicate, and then how much weight to afford those messages? So I've just spent way too much time with statisticians to ignore the importance of representativeness anytime we're trying to generalize views of some to reflect the views of all people or any particular group of people. So I'm really uncomfortable with anyone who says, for example, that 20,000 comments shows what the people in general want. And if we fall back to saying that 20,000 comments reflect what some people want, then I'm just not sure how to weight that in a principled way. I also think it's a bad idea to completely ignore the role of intermediaries in how they shape and direct these campaigns. The idea that we're getting pure expressions of public interest via campaign organizers is problematic. And if folks doubt this, I would just ask them to consider whether they're as welcoming as 20,000 comments organized by a nonprofit interest group as they are 20,000 comments organized by a business. If your views on this, the value of the comments changes, I'd suggest it's worth additional thought. On the other hand, I'm also deeply uncomfortable with the idea that mass comments can never mean anything. And so I think folks in this camp need to be willing to open their minds to some possibilities. some of the ideas that we've discussed in the course of, building towards the ACUS project that Reeve mentioned includes, for example, the potential for mass comment campaigns to signal the possibility of downstream compliance problems. So if you're hearing from a lot of people who would have to comply with this law, that they don't understand it, that they're misunderstanding its function or how the government wants them to comply, that's a signal that could be useful and help you come up with ways to help the agency clarify what it's trying to do. Another example might be signaling to an agency that they missed a set of interests in their analysis. Let's say they just missed a whole group of stakeholders that they should have considered, and those folks show up in a mass comment campaign. That's useful. The other, another example is an agency's theory of the regulatory problem that they're trying to solve just might be off. So for example, if the agency's taking action to ban a particular product, for example, and a set of product users pipes up in the comment period with the use of that product that should reasonably be continued, well, that's pretty important information for the government to have. And these are all areas where the mass element of those comments is actually relevant and important to the agency. The fact that there's more than one comment is useful information. So in sum, and then I'll yield my time, my view is that we need to do just more to flesh out what we can glean from mass campaigns, and also be frank with each other, and more importantly, the public, about what we cannot in terms of representativeness.
I'd be interested in chiming in unless somebody else wants to.
Go for it, Dana.
I'll just say, Bridget, I completely agree with the way you laid that out, and I, that's more or less your view is one I've shared for quite some time, since 2010 or 2011. When I started working on these issues. I just want to add two super quick comments. One is, agencies function within a statutory structure, and there are going to be some issues where public comments simply, I think, are not relevant, or if you will, public views are not relevant. One of those is actually the Endangered Species Act, where the agencies have to decide whether an animal species is endangered based on the state of its habitat and the prospect of its continued existence. And public affection for an animal like a polar bear or dislike for a mosquito is actually just under the statutory framework, not especially relevant, although it might be a little hint to the agency that it may face pushback from congressional overseers. It's not directly relevant. On the other hand, there are lots of statutory frameworks where I think public views necessarily are relevant. So, and that might be because the agency is considering a policy issue. And Bridget, you laid out a bunch of issues to which public response clearly is relevant, like the prospect of resistance or compliance. But, another example in this regard, also from the environmental area is NEPA, where agencies are supposed to analyze environmental impacts. The administrations have gone back and forth on whether that environmental impact under the statute needs to include cumulative impact on a community. So a community like, zip code 48217 in Southwest Detroit, where there are already lots of polluting projects, the policy question here is, do the burdens already borne by such a community, should those be analyzed in trying to figure out whether a new project should be located there? That's not just a technical question, that's a values question. Is it worth it, essentially? Is it worth it to consider those environmental impacts given the time and the resources required to do additional analysis? And so I think, hearing from those communities is actually really important and relevant under the statute. The last thing I'll just say about this is, the APA in part gives us an answer to this. The APA allows any interested person to file data, views, or arguments. I think that means that when an agency receives comments that are relevant to what it's undertaking, you ought to think about them, even if they come from lots and lots of individuals and the sort of people that maybe haven't classically been filing comments in our processes. So actually, one last thing, and that is, clearly these comments can't be a vote, not only because they're not representative, but because agencies are almost never thinking only about public views. They're typically thinking about lots of different things when they consider whether to take an action, whether those are the technical issues, as well as resistance to a regulatory mandate. And that's another reason why we shouldn't think of these as a vote, but agencies should, as Bridget suggests, perhaps take them as, sort of a yellow flag. Let's investigate those stakeholders we haven't thought about before. Let's reconsider that issue we didn't dig into, or let's see which of these views are genuinely held by many members of the public.
So I was going to say, unfortunately, I think we're going to have too much agreement here, which is in some ways too bad. So, everything that you both laid out, both Bridget and Nina have laid out, makes perfectly good sense, except that most of the mass comments, when they are in fact organized by some interest group or advocacy group, don't do what Bridget was just laying out, right? They don't actually state a reason for why the party has the particular view they're expressing, right? If they did express a reason, that would be relevant information, and the agency would absolutely take that into account. But fortunately, they usually tend to be just votes. Right? They tend to be, we hate it or we love it. Mostly it's we hate it, but but there's sometimes it's they like what you're doing too. So, but and that is hard to do anything with other than just say, okay, fine, X number of people stated that they hate this. The agency really can't do much with that substantively. If they state they hate it because, in fact, there are too many projects in that zip code outside of Detroit, and we would like to see projects cited elsewhere, and that'd be great. Right? That would be relevant information, and the agency would absolutely consider it. But I will say the caveat here also is that the other topics we're touching on in terms of bot and fraudulent comments, I do wonder if you tell the advocacy groups who would gin these things up that, gee, sheer numbers, or even if you have some substance to it, the numbers may make a difference. Would you actually incentivize the submission of fraudulent comments, like just making up names and sending in more comments simply because they think that that will actually influence the outcome of rulemaking? And we certainly wouldn't want to send that message, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, and if I may, I tend to worry about sending signals about how much that sort of top line yay or nay count matters in the preambles of rules. I worry a little bit about tallying there. I also worry about using those numbers in press releases or political communications to the Hill or to the public, as though to say, the people are with us. The people are with this decision because 20,000 people sent, a yay nay vote, right? That sends a signal that those 20,000 comments really made the difference, and that that they're a valuable signal, and they may serve a political purpose, but from an analytical perspective, I worry about the type of incentives that creates downstream.
Yeah, you would even think in a statistical mean that wouldn't make much of a difference anyway. 20,000 out of 330 million people is not really a particularly significant sample, I wouldn't think.
Fantastic. No, this has been a great discussion, and I think it tees up a lot of the issues very nicely. I have just one sort of follow-up question that I'll maybe pose to Nina in the initial instance, but for the group as well, and then we'll move on to the next topic, which is bot comments or computer-generated comments. But I think what sort of Dan says frames it very nicely. So I'm interested in, I think we all agree that there are certainly instances where there's situational knowledge or where a particular group may be disproportionately impacted by a particular regulation. And in that case, it definitely is relevant to, to hear from that community and to get their views, whether or not you'd characterize it as sort of factual or more opinion. This will affect me in the following ways, or, I don't like this rule because, it affects my life in the following ways. What I'm interested in is if anyone of the panelists wants to sort of defend the notion or suggest that obviously it's not a vote. I think we all agree on that. But is there ever any instance where simply the total number of comments, even if they're purely opinion based, should be taken into account by the agency in some fashion? Certainly it shouldn't be dispositive. Certainly the agency shouldn't say, okay, 60% of people felt this way, so that's the direction we're going. But if there's a large response, and if the comments, especially sort of point overwhelmingly in one direction or the other, is there any instance where the agency should take that into account? So let me ask Nina first, and then other people's thoughts as well.
So, I sort of take your question to be broadly, like, given the phenomenon that we currently have, what should agencies be doing with it? Is there a circumstance where they should ever say, we got more pro comments than con comments, and that's going to influence the direction. And I think we're all in agreement. The answer to that has to be no. And it has to be no because the comments may not be representative, as Bridget mentioned earlier, and the agency typically under statutory framework has got to take a range of things into account, and public views on one aspect of the problem are just public views on one aspect of the problem. That said, I think agencies do have to seriously engage these comments, and candidly more seriously than agencies often have. One thing is actually agencies, I think, need to be more direct with the public about what makes for a useful comment of this sort. And I think the kind of we like it, we hate it comment, comments are always going to vary in sophistication, even from the most sophisticated commenters, but from individual commenters, that's probably the least useful kind of comment. Even the context, what's the perspective of the person that prompts them to support or oppose the policy, and why would be useful, reasons would be useful. So I think agencies should be trying to encourage higher quality individual engagement with their policies. And then what should they do with them once they come in? Again, I think I mentioned earlier what I think of as a concept of a sort of a yellow flag. There might be certain kinds of comments that should just cause the agency to pause and say, look, there is public resistance here we haven't previously considered. There is a stakeholder group we haven't previously engaged. We want to reach out to them. Or there's a widely held public view that we didn't fully attend to, and we're going to dig in to that view in some other ways. And that could be other forms of engagement. That could be reaching out, honestly, to political officials to try to get a sense of these preferences, and then including that. And the last thing I'll say is I think agencies need to offer an answer, even a brief one. If an agency has received 30,000 comments on, American history and civics, and 20,000 of them say, we want you to teach this, this kind of stuff in our schools, or we don't. One thing we have been hearing at ACUS from nonprofits is that people who contact their government want to know that they've been heard, even if the government doesn't do what they want. That's an essential part of procedural concepts of justice. Even if the response from the agency is to say briefly, we hear you, we're considering what you say, but for a variety of reasons, we're going to go in a different direction. I think agencies ought to be doing that. And I actually think both the net neutrality rulemakings, both the Obama era net neutrality rulemaking and the Trump era net neutrality rulemakings are not bad examples of agencies trying to do just this. And I hope more agencies will consider doing that.
If I could add to that, I totally agree. And I think everybody in the panel would agree that some kind of outreach and education would be, well taken. That said, I think we have to recognize that there's a mismatch between the information that rulemakers would like to receive and the incentives of organizations for mobilizing mass comment campaigns in the first place. So when I talk to organizations that sponsor mass comment campaigns, and I ask them why they do it, many times their answers have nothing to do with influencing the content of the regulation. They might know that their mass expression would be useful for the politicals if they like the politicals, or their expression of mass sentiment might make it problematic for the politicals if they don't like the politicals. They also have like intra-organizational reasons to do this kind of mobilization. That is, these are great ways to identify like-minded individuals who could become members or more active members or donors. And so, when I talk to organizations that create the largest numbers in some of these mass comment campaigns, they say, look, our members want to read what they sign. And if it's more than a couple of sentences, they won't read it and they won't sign it. So our best practice is, we ask them to sign some statement of sentiment that's very short, sweet, and to the point. And so that's sort of the interests of the organizations, right, as they try to mobilize large numbers. But that then produces exactly the kind of comment that we're all talking about as not necessarily producing useful, decisional, actionable information for an agency. So I think no matter what we do on outreach and education about the notice and comment process, there are these broader incentives that mean that mass comment campaigns are here to stay, and particularly mass comment campaigns of a particular sentiment-only variety.
Yeah, I would add too, I think that's really helpful, Steve, just to understand what some of the incentives are. The only thing I could add to your list is that I'm aware that some groups, approach the public comment process as a way to slow down actions that they were uncomfortable with an administration taking. And so, and you could envision that happening no matter who's in the White House. If your interest is to sort of just give the agency a lot of homework to churn through before they can proceed to a final rule. I mean, I'm aware that there is a tactical reason to try to get a lot of, obviously, if your comments are 99% the same, this isn't going to work because we'll just use the deduplication. But if there's a lot of personalized comment in there, part of the tactical goal can be, I'm not at all saying it always is, but can be to intentionally slow the government down. And so I think we can't ignore that when we think about how these campaigns function in the real world.
Yeah, that is, just to follow up on that, it is a time-consuming problem. It doesn't necessarily slow down the rulemaking often. I mean, because what'll happen is some poor staff person just needs to sift through them, right? I mean, if it's a lot of times you'll see these letters are kind of pre-ginned up by the organization, but they leave the ability to type in your own additional sentence or handwrite a sentence, and so the deduplication software helps a lot with that, but it's not 100%. So somebody just has to check it out. As a practical matter, the analysis that we're going to do is still going to be the same regardless of those numbers of comments. So that just takes the time it takes. I'm not sure, in the larger, like the net neutrality or the waters of the US, where you're getting millions of comments, that may be some bit of a time sink, but when there's 150 or 500 or even 1,000 comments, I don't think it costs us too much extra time.
Can I add to that as well? I want to just make one quick comment. Dan, you've been mentioning that organizations might gin up comments, and I just want to flag that because I actually think it's a little bit of a red herring to focus on whether a person has sent in a comment that kind of borrows language suggested by an organization or whether they kind of drafted it all themselves. We certainly accept that regulated entities and trade associations hire lawyers to draft their comments, and we don't take those comments, and we shouldn't take those comments any less seriously. I think the important part is that the commenter has signed on to and has endorsed the particular comment and has made the effort to submit it. To me, that's what matters. And now I recognize comments vary in quality, and I must confess, I have found plenty of junk on regulations.gov. I once found an uploaded credit card statement. It's not a perfect docket, but I think in general, we have to take seriously the notion that people have actually sent in comments wherever they got the language from. The other thing I just want to mention, I think Bridget makes a really interesting point about slowing down rules, but I wonder if that actually doesn't necessarily cut against individual comments, which I gather from Dan are fairly easy to process. My understanding in this area is that the biggest problem of sort of drowning an agency in information is actually from regulated entities who send in tons and tons of data that the agencies have to pick through. And Professor Wendy Wagner of University of Texas at Austin has a really interesting article about this called, I think, something like Filter Failure in Agency Processes, where she describes that regulated entities that oppose regulation may actually just try to drown an agency in data and slow them down that way. And I suspect that's a more significant problem.
I should say, I don't say gin up in a pejorative way. What I mean by that more is that they're organizing people to send in those comments. I don't know that there is otherwise a groundswell for large commenting campaigns on a particular rulemaking, absent that kind of activity by organized groups to send in comments. And as for the if we get large from whatever source, if we get studies and data, we love that, right? Like, the more of it, the better. And so if we have to spend time going through it and sometimes doing a supplemental proposal or something because someone sent us a study, so much the better, because it provides better defensibility for whatever decision we make at the end.
Fantastic. So this has been a great discussion on mass comments. I think it's sort of surfaced a lot of extremely interesting both policy issues as well as technical issues. Just in the interest of sort of ensuring we touch on each of the topics, I'll move now to computer-generated comments, and I'll, I guess, use the moderator's prerogative. I'll maybe repose one of the questions here. So, for all the reasons we've discussed, given that, individuals may have situational knowledge, and it may, in some instances, be relevant that, the comment is actually being generated by a human being. There are definitely some risks, associated with computer-generated comment campaigns. But I think an interesting question is, are there potential benefits associated with computer-generated comment campaigns? Presumably an algorithm can go through and, comb the literature in a way that a human being may not be able to do. That's one of the real benefits of AI. So I'm interested in the views of the group, I guess on both of those questions, what are the risks associated with computer-generated comments, but also maybe what are some possible areas where it could actually move the ball forward and actually increase the sophistication of agencies' rulemaking processes. So let me turn actually to Bridget in the initial instance, and I think maybe Steve might have some thoughts too, because he worked on that aspect of the ACUS project. And then I'm very interested in everyone's views on that topic. So Bridget.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And so this, for me, has been one of the more fun aspects of the ACUS project that some of us are working on. Not that every aspect of the ACUS project hasn't been a blast, but this in particular was a highlight for me. So I'm really interested in thinking about whether there might be productive, constructive use cases for computer-generated comments. And Mike Livermore has suggested an idea that I think everyone would agree with, which is that you could have a program that takes all proposed regulatory text that comes out and, say, a proposed rule, runs it through a spell checker, provides an automatic or maybe semi-automatic comment back to the agency, basically a spell check helper bot. Okay, this should be like non-controversial. You could add something that like checks for broken links to the CFR, or other just basic assists where you're just providing the government agency kind of like a second set of eyes, just in case they might have made some mistakes, some outright mistakes. So that's sort of one use case that I think most people would say, like, hey, that seems like a really like simple and good thing to sort of stand up. And that would largely be computer generated material. So that's one way to conceive of it, as sort of a less problematic or creepy set of activities. Another one, just to take it one step further, is that I'm aware that there are already instances in our lives when AI is doing something that we think of as socially useful. So an example that comes to me most readily is credit card fraud alerts. So I really appreciate it when my credit card company pings me to ask if I bought a new computer in Arizona, because it knows I'm not usually in Arizona and that I don't buy computers all that often. And it's not a person who triggers that alert. It's some sort of AI or other system. Don't ask me, I'm not a computer scientist, but there's some system that's watching for unusual spending patterns or unusual spending relative to my baseline pattern. And I suppose I could find that creepy, but I don't. I appreciate it. It means I don't get stuck with a bill for a computer that I didn't buy in Arizona. So now turning to rulemaking, we often lament that due to collective action problems, it can be really hard to get individual people to engage in the rulemaking process. I mean, we've just been talking about mass comment campaigns, but that's unusual to have so many people show up in a docket. Normally, we're focused more on how do we get more people, plugged into the rulemaking process. So, to speak more plainly, people are busy. It's only weirdos like us who might read the Federal Register on any given day, But if based on my spending pattern or my credit report or affiliations I might have in LinkedIn or Facebook or any sort of existing set of administrative data, I could train a bot to kind of predict for me what my reactions might be to a proposed rule. So maybe it could auto-generate a comment for me, or maybe if I really trusted it, it could send it on my behalf, or send it to me for approval, and then I send it if I agree. So just to give you an example, if I book a lot of campsite rentals, something I'm thinking about as I plan my summer, perhaps a bot might come to know that I like the great outdoors and that I might be happy to support, or at least want to know more about, proposals that make it easier for people to get out and camp. So if we're worried about helping people show up in the rulemaking process, I would offer that these types of digital assistants should actually affirmatively be in the mix.
Thanks, Bridget. I'll just add something very briefly that comes out of the ACUS project. on computer generated comments. And that is one thing we discovered is that almost everything we know about computer generated comments comes from the net neutrality experience. Like we have very little information outside of that one case about basic things like how often bots submit comments in rulemakings, who's behind the bots, what do those kind of comments tend to say? Like we don't know any of that. And so like all of Bridget's forward thinking then is like, these are essentially like hypothetical, scenarios. And like, all of our conversation about computer generated comments, I mean, like we know intellectually that the future is now, but like, we don't have much information about the actual facts on the ground. And so, if we just think about it, and I'll defer to the lawyers on the panel and in the audience, right? I mean, it strikes me that relevant information must be considered by an agency, right? And regardless of whether that's a bot generated comment or a traditional human generated comment. So, but anyway, just the empirical point is so fascinating that, this is essentially a discussion about net neutrality.
Can I
would agree with that. Because it is relevant. If it's relevant, we're going to look at it. If the bot can somehow, as Bridget posits, go through studies and data and submit information that matters for the particular rulemaking, we'd be foolish to not pay attention to it. The other thing is, I'm not sure how we necessarily would know that it was created by a bot. That's so. Unless there's some kind of a signal to it somehow. I'm sorry, Nate.
So I'll just add just a couple quick thoughts. One is, for what it's worth, unlike individuals, I don't think bots have a right to file comments in the rulemaking. The APA says interested persons can file, but could they be the source of useful information? Clearly, yes. On the other hand, even in a hypothetical way, of course. On the other hand, they also might be the sources of confusion. I think we're still hoping to talk about mal-attributed comments or comments that don't accurately represent where they're coming from. But that said, I mean, as we know from other areas, and I'm also not a computer scientist, but we certainly know from other areas that AI and various algorithms that are used for decision making in other areas have lots of problems. Facial recognition is an obvious example. Here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I am, there's a lot of experimentation with automated vehicles. They have their issues. They don't always recognize the stop sign, so I think because we don't fully know the value and the risks of this kind of information yet, I think at a minimum at this stage, these kinds of comments have to be clearly identified as such, and ideally agencies need to be able, whether it's by contacting the source of the comment or some other way, agencies need to be able to understand the algorithms or the programs that gave rise to these comments, to be able to assess essentially how valid is the information that they're contributing to the process. It could be useful, but it could also be infected by other problems, and agencies need the context, I think, to be able to start to handle comments that come from AI type mechanisms.
And another issue that comes to play here is that that could be a way for hackers to try to get into an agency's systems too. And I don't know anything about that. I'm not a computer scientist either, obviously, but if somebody is sending us some kind of message with an email attachment to it, then you click on the attachment and
that message.
Yeah, I mean, what do you do with that kind of thing? So that is a risk factor that we would have to consider. But again, I'm not sure how we would necessarily identify, which I think that's how hackers get into a lot of places too, right? Because people click on things they weren't supposed to without knowing it.
Yeah, I sort of ponder on the identification issue. I feel like anyone generating these things in good faith might be willing to say that this was generated by a computer, and anyone who isn't probably wouldn't. And so I'm not sure ultimately the value of the signal of like requiring a front end attestation about whether something was generated by a computer or not. I'm not sure that it won't be perfect information. And so I don't know it'll serve the value of trying to help the agency know, okay, this one we need to be careful about. I think they're not going to know in practice.
So maybe that transitions to our last issue, Reeve, because here we're talking about, the good bot comment and the bad bot comment and how difficult it is to distinguish between them. But the bad bot problem is another variant of the malattributed comments problem.
Exactly. No, Nita's exactly right. And that, well tees up sort of our final topic, malattributed comments. At least that's the term we use in the ACUS project to refer to sort of a subset of fraudulent comments where essentially the name signed at the bottom of the comment is not, in fact, the person who's submitting it. It's either, another individual, or it is another individual, or in some cases a computer. The computer generated comments are often also malattributed in the sense that a bot writes a comment and then it either puts a pseudonym at the end, or in some cases actually finds somebody else's identity, misappropriates somebody else's identity, and submits it as if it's coming from that person. So I guess sort of the final question I have for the group is part of building on this discussion, and then we'll try to leave a little bit of time to get to any final audience questions that refer back to some of the previous topics. And that is, that there's really a trade-off here. On the one hand, we are obviously interested in promoting the integrity of the process, and both computer-generated comments and malattributed comments can threaten that. On the other hand, if the agency is too aggressive in quarantining comments or putting in place something like recaptcha technology or a more complex version of recaptcha technology to try to screen these things out, that might prevent some legitimate commenting, or it might raise the barrier to entry in a way that makes people less likely to want to participate in the process. So there's a conflict there. And so I'm interested in, I guess, each of your views, and I'll just open it up broadly as to sort of what the optimal balance is with that trade-off, and sort of what are some things that agencies can do to ensure they're promoting the integrity of the process, but not doing so in a way that either would chill commenting or would pull comments out of the docket that are actually legitimate.
I guess I'll start, which is, this is one that I don't think is different in the electronic world than it was previously in the hard copy world. Right? If we were to receive a letter from an entity signed by Joe Smith claiming to be, whatever product engineer or X, whatever topic, we wouldn't know whether Joe Smith really works for that company, doesn't work for that company. Was it really Joe Smith? There's really no way to kind of police that unless there's a letter that comes in from pick an automobile company sends a letter to the transportation department that's signed by the CEO that says we hate the internal combustion engine. We would probably be a little wondering about that one, but chances are that the entity that is claiming to have submitted it, the real entity would probably chime in and say, well, gee, that wasn't us, right? And if that were to happen, we would take that comment down. The only, I did run into this once, and this was many years ago, and it actually was in the hard copy world where I was at the Commerce Department at the time, and there was a proceeding that we were working on where there was a comment that was purported to come from a particular individual, and we put it in the docket, and the individual contacted us and said, well, those are my words. I provided it to a different agency in a different proceeding. I didn't send them to you. And so I'm not participating in your proceeding. Please remove my letter from your docket. And we did. I mean, we just took it down. And beyond that, I'm not sure what else we could do to really kind of root this out.
I could add a comment at this point unless somebody else wants to make a note. All right. I guess I would say, I think in part for the reasons Bridget mentioned earlier, the identity of the commenter often does matter in these proceedings. It's not just what is said in the comment. So, what person might come from a particular community or a particular religious organization, or a particular Native American tribe. If we're talking about an Americans with Disabilities Act rulemaking about building access, it might matter that a commenter says, I'm a person who uses a wheelchair. So I think agencies do need to make some kind of effort to assure themselves that commenters are who they say they are. It is absolutely unreasonable to ask an agency to investigate every commenter, but it seems to me to make sense to do two things. One is remind commenters, you can't misrepresent yourselves to the government. And that's illegal. And an agency might be alert over time to red flags that a comment is being submitted under a false identity. And honestly, at some point, bots might be useful in figuring out, which comments are real and which ones are not. So Reeve, you asked the other question, might this be too big a barrier to widespread participation in rulemaking? I just don't think we have a clear answer yet. I guess what I would say is, you raise an important point. We need to engage people as widely as possible, including communities of color, poor communities that are otherwise underrepresented. At the same time, we have to have some safeguards for this process. And I actually think the way we have to go is basically experimentation. Start with CAPTCHAs, start with warnings, or ask people to click on affirmations that they are who they say they are, and see how that affects participation. And maybe one thing we could do is experiment in some rulemakings with CAPTCHAs only, and in others with affirmations only, and collect data on participation impacts.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, my impression on this is, the fact that it's bad is right there in the title, malattributed. It's right there, first three letters. So, I mean, I think we're talking about ways to discourage behavior that by definition we find problematic. And I think there you have to think about trade-offs between the risks of having malattributed comments make their way into the docket and thinking about the unintended consequences of possible interventions. And Nina mentioned CAPTCHA. I mean, technical solutions like CAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA are promising, but if I recall correctly, CAPTCHA, which is the one with the grid of pictures where you have to sort of say which ones have the crosswalks or chimneys or what have you, that's CAPTCHA. And one of the challenges of CAPTCHA is that if you are not a sighted person, you can't engage with CAPTCHA. And so reCAPTCHA is sort of the version that came after that and does more to intuit sort of the way intuit that you're a human based on the sort of the way you're engaging with that website. So I think maybe that got us past that particular challenge, but I think we have to constantly stay vigilant about, and adapt the technology to be responsive to new information about what problems our solutions, I mean, almost inevitably create. There's hardly ever a perfect solution that doesn't have sort of downstream effects that we need to be attentive to.
So I would just say that that would all make sense if we could identify a particular problem, but I just don't know that we get a lot of comments that are submitted by Joe Smith that are really, Jane Doe submitting them. I just don't think it happens. I can think of one example in 30 plus years of working for the government where I actually saw it. And I just don't see the government commenting process as the way that if my neighbor were upset with me that they wanted to, kind of falsify my name and, call me out on something, that would be their mode of doing it. There are probably other ways to, ruin my life than.
What's really interesting, Dan, is that like in the ACUS project, there's this kind of disconnect as the consultants, as we did research and talked to various, types of individuals who are involved in rulemaking or in commenting. And you talk to the computer scientists, or you look at the computer science research, and it's happening. We can fake you out, piece of cake, right? You talk to lawyers. The New York Attorney General's report, is out there. This is problematic behavior. Then we talk to the agency folks, who are in the trenches of rulemaking, and we hear crickets yawning, right? Like, yeah, okay. And so it's a real interesting dichotomy between sort of like just warnings of death and doom and sort of shrugging of the shoulders on the other side. I just wanted to point that out, because that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, and my takeaway from that is that basically this is just what we have to watch for the future. That we can assume the tech is going to get better. We can assume especially as long as people are out hyping that everyone should be, making their voices heard, that we're going to see more of this, right? To some extent, that helps stimulate the interest in having large numbers of comments, right? Those downstream incentives. And so I think it may not, and also it may not be a challenge right now, but I think it's reasonable to expect that it will be. And we need to be thinking now about the types of measures that we'll take, not just respect to sort of mass malattributed comments, but the individual deep fake type, both of which kind of present challenges for an agency trying to assemble, a rulemaking record.
I agreed. I think we're going to just see much more sophistication in these comments over time. They're going to represent themselves as coming from different stakeholder groups, and they just may not. And I agree. I think it makes sense to try to for the government to get ahead of these issues rather than just reacting to them.
Fantastic. So I guess we've reached our 4 o'clock mark, but I think that's a fantastic way to conclude. I think, what each of you has said, I think rings absolutely true, that this is obviously an important area, but it's only going to get more important as we go forward, as the technologies continue to evolve and agencies continue grappling with these issues. So let me conclude by saying, first, thanks to everyone who participated. I've seen there's been a pretty robust set of questions. I've tried to the extent possible to work them in over the course of the discussion, but we hope each of you will sort of stay engaged with the topic. It's obviously something that, continues to remain relevant, and that I think each of us, definitely is going to be, continuing to grapple with going forward. And let me thank each of our panelists for this fantastic discussion today. I think this was really very valuable, and thanks to each of you for taking the time and for your excellent comments. So with that, I suppose we'll conclude. So thanks again, and hope everyone has a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.